Well, this is embarrassing. When you have Keir Starmer on the world stage insisting that we have free speech in the United Kingdom, that we're proud of it, we protect it, that we've had it for a very long time, that is just not how the rest of the world sees us. As is from a damning report from the United States accusing the UK of significant human rights issues with regard to, among other things, restrictions on our free speech. And just as we move through this video, if you believe in free speech, please give this video a thumbs up. Let's see how many thousands of people believe in free speech and that we should maintain it. And please do subscribe to the channel while you're at it. I will fight for free speech and your rights to express yourself as you see fit. Thank you so much. Hat tip here to Sky News regarding this report from the United States, and a reminder of this excruciatingly cringeworthy interview where there was a slap across the face of the United Kingdom with regard to free speech, and Keir Starmer responded as follows. Let me remind you of this interview.
We do have, of course, a special relationship with our friends in the UK and also with some of our European allies, but we also know that there have been infringements on free speech that actually affect not just the British. Of course, what the British do in their own country is up to them, but also affect American technology companies and by extension American citizens. So that is something that we'll talk about today at lunch.
We've had free speech for a very, very long time in the United Kingdom, and it will last for a very, very long time. Well, no, I mean, certainly we wouldn't want to reach across US citizens, and we don't, and that's absolutely right. But in relation to free speech in the UK, I'm very proud of our history.
How can anybody say that you're proud of free speech in the United Kingdom when you have unequivocal evidence that it is being curtailed, it is being tracked and monitored, and in many cases prosecuted and unquestionably infringed? And that is not just my opinion. We see it every day. We see people having police turn up, question that they've posted something online. In the last week alone, I've had three occasions I've had to advise upon the content of emails that have been sent or other such things where people have been upset by what has been said to them. It's been reported to the police and they've been out pronto within a matter of hours, it seems, or days at the very least, whereas the police are obviously under-resourced and they've got lots of other things that they could be doing, and yet they are visiting people to talk about someone being upset, reporting that they've been upset by something they've said. So let's go to this report here, because this is unequivocally what the United States views upon the infringements of free speech in the United Kingdom. This is the 2024 country report on human rights practices for the United Kingdom. Now, this is available online. This is retrospectively looking back at how things have changed and developed over the last year, and it raises some eyebrow-raising concerns with how the UK is viewed internationally. It quite clearly says in the executive summary here, the human rights situation worsened in the UK during the year. Significant human rights issues included credible reports of serious restrictions on freedom of expression, including enforcement of or threat of criminal or civil laws in order to limit expression and crimes, violence, or threats of violence motivated by anti-Semitism. Thankfully, there were no reports of extrajudicial killings or coercion in population control. However, when it came to liberty and freedom of the press, now many of you will know that the United States holds the freedom of expression as absolutely sacrosanct, and this is obviously something they are going to pay close attention to. But alas, the report does make some quite damning comments about the United Kingdom with regard to the freedom of the press, freedom of expression in general, and we need to open our eyes and see this for what it really is. This is how the UK is viewed internationally. Now, it says here, the law generally provided for freedom of speech, including for members of the press and other media, and the government generally respected this right, though there were specific areas of concern, including involving restrictions on political speech deemed hateful or offensive, as well as speech within public space protection orders, allowing local councils to limit speech rights within designated areas. Now, I've talked about those a number of times, and I have my concerns with those because, just to go off on a brief tangent about public spaces protection orders, if a local authority deems it necessary to set one of these up, they're supposed to have some kind of consultation. They're supposed to have a meeting and decide what it's supposed to cover. and it's not supposed to overlap with other laws or deal with things that are already more appropriately dealt with by other legislation or even other authorities. For example, a local authority banning drones is not supposed to do that because drones are supposed to be, and they are indeed, governed by the Civil Aviation Authority, which regulates the airspace and appropriate legislation. Now, when it comes to the restriction of the freedom of expression, you've noticed in previous videos that I've covered, and you'll have heard, where people have been arrested for silent prayer. So not even saying anything. The Public Spaces Protection Order specifically restricted people from praying within a certain zone near abortion clinics in these examples. Now, the problem with these things are, if they are not challenged at the High Court within 6 weeks, they go ahead, they're in place for 3 years, and they can be renewed or amended as they see fit. Now, let's be honest, most people are not going to take the local authority to the High Court because they personally object to this, and therefore these things very often go unchallenged. This report continues. These restrictions on freedom of speech could include prohibitions on efforts to influence others when inside a restricted area, even though through prayer or silent protests. It goes on, the law prohibited expressions of hatred towards persons because of their color, race, nationality, including citizenship, ethnic or national origin, religion, sexual orientation, as well as any communication that was deemed threatening or abusive and was intended to harass, alarm or distress a person. Now, there are certain limits that I think you might say are unacceptable, and it's supposed to be a high bar. In fact, ironically as this sounds, you can find it if you just look for it on X. You'll find a clip of Keir Starmer way back when he was practicing as a lawyer. I think he was practicing as a lawyer at the time when he was interviewed for this portion. He said that it is a high bar to reach for expression to be so offensive that they need to take action on it.
Where a communication is, as it were, merely offensive, grossly offensive, etc., then principles of free speech and free expression require there to be a high threshold and dictate that a prosecution is unlikely to be in the public interest in many of those cases.
And otherwise it should be protected. At least then he sounded like he was protecting free speech. And on the face of it, it sounds like he does now, but it's not the reality from what we are seeing. Reading on, it then says the law authorises UK authorities, including the Office of Communications, Ofcom, to monitor all forms of communications for speech they deemed illegal. With the Online Safety Act coming into force, defined the category of online harm, expressly expanded Ofcom's authority to include American media and technology firms with a substantial number of British users, regardless of whether they're corporate presence in the UK. Under the law, companies were required to engage in proactive illegal content risk assessment to mitigate the risk of encountering speech deemed illegal by Ofcom. Experts warned that one effect of the bill could be government regulations to reduce or eliminate effective encryption and therefore user privacy on platforms. It goes on, expansive and unclear restrictions on potentially prejudicial reporting on ongoing court and tribunal proceedings limited the freedom of the press. In one instance, UK contempt of court laws forced US magazine The New Yorker to geo-block British subscribers from reading an online article regarding an ongoing court case. And the Law Commission's looking at reform. Now, my personal view on this is that if we trust the jury system, we should trust the jury not to read any nonsense that they read online and only deal with what they are presented in court. Now, of course, people can see things online unwittingly, even if they're not going out to research it. And unless they stay off social media completely, they are going to see something. And if someone were deliberately trying to sway the course of justice, that might be a different matter. But merely posting your opinion, I've always maintained the view that that shouldn't come under the realms of contempt of court. But of course it can, and it does, as we've seen. So I'm always cautious about what I say about a live trial. I always tell other people to be cautious about what they say about a live trial, but I personally think this whole thing should be revamped, reformed, and I think we should trust the jury. If we trust the jury, we should trust them completely, and we should trust them not to be swayed by something they see online, and instead trust what they hear in court and directed by the judge as to what evidence they should rely on. Reading on April the 1st, Scottish Government implemented the Hate Crime and Public Order Scotland Act, including an introduction of offensive of stirring up hatred And what this misses out here, which I think is even worse, is that this applied even in your own home. Now, you might remember there was a whole back and forth on social media with J.K. Rowling, who follows me on X, by the way. But there was a whole back and forth there because she said, come and arrest me. Because you might remember that I did cover this new piece of law, believe it or not, on the 1st of April last year. And there was a whole chunk of irony about it, not just the fact that it was released on April Fool's Day, but this law made it an offence to stir up hatred among a lot of different areas, including, for example, transgender identity and sexual orientation and others, even in your own home, because it doesn't provide the defence of doing so in your own home. It just says if you behave in a way that a reasonable person would consider to be threatening, abusive, insulting, or communicate material that a reasonable person would consider to be threatening, abusive, or insulting, etc. I did a whole video on that and how J.K. Rowling got caught up in it, and the police said they might be investigating her, but ultimately dropped it because they realised that if they did proceed with it and it all failed, it would make the whole thing look like more of a catastrophe than it was in the first place. But anyway, we come back to this report, which did mention this bit of law, which I think, personally, is quite ridiculous. But then it goes on to talk about censorship by governments, military, intelligence, police forces, criminal groups, armed, etc. And naturally, this report mentions what happened after the Southport attack and the restrictions on speech there afterwards. This section opens up with legal restrictions on speech labelled as threatening, offensive, and constituted a hate crime applied to print and broadcast media, including social media. It said the government called on companies, including US firms, to censor speech deemed misinformation or hate speech. The DPP threatened to prosecute and seek the extradition of those who repost, repeat, or amplify a message which is false, threatening, or stirs up racial or religious hatred. Now, I did another video on whether the UK government could actually extradite anybody from the United States based on what they post here. And I actually had a US attorney wade in and give his views. There's a few videos on that. I'll link them below. Fascinating input from the US attorney. And in short, no is the answer, because it would have to be a crime both here and in the United States. And can you imagine trying to convince someone in the United States on the authority side there that this is a sufficient crime to extradite somebody from the US because they've reposted something that was false? Not going to happen. They are not going to agree, therefore it's not going to happen, in my respectful view. This goes on. The CPS shared a video online stating that citizens should think before you post and threatening legal consequences for violations of the law. This is how free speech has been curtailed, all the while reminding you and remembering that Keir Starmer sat and said that he's proud of free speech in the UK, which evidently is being eroded before our eyes. So to that end, this is not a sponsored video, but I'd urge you to join Free Speech Union and support them in the fight to maintain free speech. Not sponsored, but I'll put the link below. And so this goes on. After the Southport attack, and numerous individuals were arrested for online speech about the attack and its motivations, though in some cases charges were later dropped. Numerous non-government organisations and media outlets criticised the government's approach to censoring speech, both in principle and in the perceived weaponisation of law enforcement against political views disfavoured by authorities. In other words, you say something the government doesn't like, they believe, this is the US view here, that it appears that there's a censoring approach to speech because it's political commentary that is not approved or favoured by the authorities themselves. This report goes on. While many media observers deemed two-tier enforcement of these laws following the Southport attacks an especially grievous example of government censorship, censorship of ordinary Britons was increasingly routine, often targeted at political speech. Again, the US report's words, not mine. This is how we are perceived internationally. So when I say something like this, it is not me being right-wing. It is not me jumping on any bandwagon. This is an international view of the United Kingdom levels of free speech. Bearing in mind, in the World Index on freedom of expression, we've dropped down below being a free speech nation to less restricted, which I think is a major jump. It goes on. In July, a man was jailed and handed an 8-week sentence for posting a meme suggesting a link between migrants and knife crime. Now, at best, this is a joke. The meme, that is. At worst, it's his opinion and he genuinely believes it and he's expressing it through a meme. This is not something somebody should be jailed for. in my respectful view. It goes on. In October, an individual was convicted in England for engaging in silent prayer in violation in a safe zone. That's one of the abortion vicinities I was talking about. It goes on. In the British Virgin Islands, the law criminalised sending offensive messages through a computer with imprisonment of up to 14 years and a fine if convicted. The law applied to messages that were deemed grossly offensive. Now, I've explained that before, where they are grossly offensive. We have this threshold. Or had menacing character, or that were sent for the purpose of causing annoyance or inconvenience. And even then, the wording has been disputed in many different cases. So this is the view of the United Kingdom on the world stage as it stands right now. Hat tip to Sky News, where I saw this first. But this report from the US is quite damning. And if Keir Starmer is genuinely proud of free speech and our history of it and wants to protect it, then things need to change. There needs to be bold steps to protect free speech and not criminalizing people for something they say online and stopping people from being afraid of saying what they think online. This is a public platform. It's public discussion. It should be an open platform with the freedom of expression. If you agree, please hit the like button on this video and subscribe to the channel where I will fight for free speech. And as always, thank you for watching.